Amara Bennett stood alone in the middle of a room she did not recognize as her own. The candles had been lit an hour ago by someone else's hands, and now their light trembled on the walls like it was nervous too. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. Somewhere down the hallway, she could hear the last of the wedding guests saying their goodbyes, laughing, calling out blessings she barely registered. She was a married woman now. She had been one for exactly 6 hours. She sat down on the edge of the bed, then stood up again almost immediately, smoothing her hands over the fabric of her dress as if that small motion could calm the storm inside her chest. Her sister Priya had helped her change out of the heavy wedding gown into something simpler, softer, and had squeezed her hand before leaving the room with a look that was meant to be reassuring, but only made Amara's stomach twist harder. "You'll be fine," Priya had whispered. "He seems kind." He seems kind. That was all anyone could say about Daniel Hart, the man she had married that afternoon. He seemed kind. He seemed decent. He seemed like a good match on paper. Their families had known each other for years, their fathers had done business together, and when the idea of the marriage had first been raised at a dinner table 6 months ago, nobody had asked Amara what she actually wanted. They had asked if she agreed, which was different from asking if she wanted it. She had said yes because saying no felt impossible, because her mother's eyes had been so full of hope, because Daniel himself had seemed steady and polite the few times they had met before the wedding. But steady and polite were not the same as safe. Amara knew that better than anyone. She thought of Naomi, her closest friend since childhood, who had married 2 years earlier in a similar arrangement. Naomi had come to visit a few months after her wedding, and over tea, with her voice low so no one else could hear, she had told Amara things that still lived in the back of Amara's mind like a shadow that never fully left. Naomi had described a husband who treated the marriage bed as a duty to be performed, cold and businesslike, with no warmth in it at all. She had cried while telling the story, and Amara had held her hand and promised herself, quietly, that she would never let herself be surprised the way Naomi had been surprised. She would go into her own marriage with her eyes open, expecting nothing gentle, so that nothing could break her the way it had broken her friend. That was why she was sitting here now, in a beautiful room filled with white flowers and soft lamplight, bracing herself for something cold. She heard footsteps in the hallway outside, slow and unhurried, and she went completely still. Her hands gripped the edge of the blanket beneath her. This was it. This was the moment Naomi had warned her about, the moment every married woman in her family had spoken of only in careful, guarded tones, as if it were a rite of passage that could not be discussed honestly, only endured. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Amara closed her eyes and took a breath, trying to steady herself. She told herself she was strong. She told herself she could survive one difficult night, and that afterward life would settle into whatever routine it was going to settle into, and she would find her own kind of peace within it, even if that peace did not include love. There was a soft knock. She hadn't expected a knock. In her mind, she had pictured the door simply opening, the way she imagined a husband would enter a room he now had every right to enter. But there was a knock, gentle, almost hesitant, as if the person on the other side was not entirely sure he should be there either. "Come in," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. The door opened slowly, and Daniel stepped inside. He was still dressed in the shirt from earlier in the day, though he had removed the jacket and loosened the collar. His dark hair was slightly messy, as if he had run his hand through it more than once. He looked at her from across the room, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Amara studied his face, searching for the coldness she had prepared herself to find. She looked for indifference, for the businesslike expression Naomi had described. Instead, what she saw confused her. Daniel looked nervous. His shoulders were tense, his hands were not quite still at his sides, and there was something in his eyes that looked almost like fear, though she could not imagine what a man in his position had to be afraid of. "Hi," he said quietly, and then seemed to regret how simple that sounded. "I mean, good evening. I wanted to make sure you were comfortable before anything else." Amara blinked. Of all the things she had imagined him saying, this was not one of them. I'm comfortable, she said carefully, though her body did not feel comfortable at all. It felt coiled tight, ready for something she could not name. Daniel nodded slowly and glanced around the room, as though looking for somewhere to put himself that would not feel intrusive. There was a small chair near the window, several feet away from the bed, and he walked toward it and sat down, putting distance between them rather than closing it. Amara had not expected that either. "Long day," he said, more to himself than to her. "Very long," she agreed. Silence stretched between them, but it was not the silence Amara had feared. It was not heavy with expectation or demand. It felt, strangely, like two people who had both walked into a room carrying weight they did not know how to set down. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said after a moment. Amara looked up at him, surprised by the question. "Of course." "Are you scared?" The question hit her harder than she expected. She had not thought anyone would simply ask. She had thought fear was something a bride was supposed to hide, something you swallowed and carried alone, the way her mother had carried it, the way Naomi had carried it until it broke her down in a quiet kitchen months later. A little, Amara admitted, because something about the honesty in his voice made it impossible to lie. Daniel let out a breath, and to her surprise, something in his posture relaxed, as if her honesty had given him permission to be honest too. "I am too," he said. Amara stared at him. "You are." "I've never done this before," he said, and then laughed softly at himself, a short, self-conscious sound. "Being married, I mean, being responsible for someone else's happiness. I keep thinking about all the ways I could get it wrong." Something in Amara's chest shifted, just slightly, like a door that had been locked for a long time creaking open by a fraction of an inch. She had not expected him to speak of her happiness at all. She had expected silence, or worse, expectation. She had not expected a man sitting across the room, keeping his distance, worried about getting things wrong. "I didn't think you would care about that," she said quietly before she could stop herself. Daniel's brow furrowed. "Why wouldn't I care?" Amara hesitated, unsure how much to say, unsure if it was her place to voice the fears she had carried into this room. But something about the calm way he was looking at her, waiting without pushing, made her want to try. "I heard stories," she said carefully, "about wedding nights, about husbands who saw it as something owed to them rather than something shared. I prepared myself for that." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was gentle but firm. "I would never want you to feel that anything is owed," he said. "Not tonight, not ever." Amara did not know what to say to that. She sat there, on the edge of the bed, in a room full of candlelight and white flowers, feeling the walls she had built over the last 6 months begin to tremble, not because they were being broken down by force, but because someone was, very gently, asking her permission to lower them herself. Outside, the last of the wedding guests had gone home. The house had grown quiet. And in that quiet, for the first time since the engagement had been announced, Amara allowed herself to wonder if she had been wrong about what tonight would be. She did not know yet how right that feeling would turn out to be. But for the first time in months, sitting across from a man who had chosen kindness over expectation, she felt something loosen inside her that she had not realized she was holding so tightly. The night was only just beginning, and already nothing was the way she had imagined it. Daniel did not move from the chair by the window for a long while. He seemed content to simply sit there, letting the silence between them settle into something less tense than it had been minutes before. Amara found herself studying him again, trying to understand this man she had married but barely knew. His features were calm, though she could still see the tightness around his eyes that told her he was working just as hard as she was to keep himself composed. "Can I tell you something?" he asked, breaking the quiet. "Yes," Amara said. "I asked my mother before the wedding what I should do tonight. I wanted to know the right way to behave, the right things to say, and she told me something I didn't expect." "What did she say?" Daniel smiled faintly, looking down at his hands. "She said the only wrong thing I could do was make you feel like you had no choice in anything. She said marriage isn't a single night. It's every night after, and if I ruin the trust on the first one, I might never get it back. Amara felt something warm settle in her chest, something she was not prepared for. She had walked into this room bracing herself for indifference, and instead she was hearing a story about a mother's advice, spoken with such sincerity that she could not doubt it was true. "Your mother sounds wise," she said. "She is. She also said I talk too much when I'm nervous, so feel free to tell me to be quiet." Amara laughed, a small surprised sound that seemed to catch them both off guard. It was the first time she had laughed all day, and it felt strange and good at once, like stretching a muscle that had been cramped for hours. "You're not talking too much," she said. "I think I needed someone to talk." Daniel looked pleased by that in a quiet, understated way. He shifted slightly in the chair, angling himself more toward her, though he still kept his distance. "Tell me about yourself," he said. "Not the version everyone talks about at family dinners, the real version." Amara considered the question for a long moment. No one had ever asked her that so directly, especially not on a night when she had expected conversation to be the last thing on anyone's mind. "I like to draw," she said finally. "Mostly buildings, old ones with a lot of history in them. My father used to take me to visit old churches and courthouses when I was young, and I would sketch the windows and the doorways. I still have notebooks full of them." "That's beautiful," Daniel said, and he sounded like he meant it. "Do you still draw?" "Not as much as I used to. Wedding planning took over everything these last few months." "Well," Daniel said, "I would like to see your notebook sometime, if you'd want to show me." Amara felt herself relax a little more, the tightness in her shoulders easing by degrees. "I would like that too." They talked for a while longer, and slowly the conversation moved beyond careful, guarded exchanges into something that felt more natural. Daniel told her about his own interests, how he had wanted to become an architect once, before family responsibilities pulled him into the family business instead. He spoke of it without bitterness, though Amara could hear the small trace of a dream that had been set aside, not forgotten. "Do you regret it," she asked, "not becoming an architect?" "Sometimes," Daniel admitted, "but I think regret is only useful if it teaches you something. Mine taught me that I don't want to make the same mistake twice. I don't want to look back one day and realize I let something important slip away because I was too afraid to hold on to it." Amara understood exactly what he meant, though she suspected he was not only talking about his career. The candles had burned lower now, and the room had settled into a comfortable dimness that made the space feel smaller, more private, though not in a way that frightened her anymore. She noticed that her hands, which had been clenched tightly in her lap since Daniel walked in, had loosened. She noticed that her breathing had slowed. She noticed, with some surprise, that she was no longer bracing herself for anything. "Can I ask you something else?" Daniel said. "Go ahead. Were you happy about the marriage? Before tonight, I mean. Or did you feel like you didn't have another option?" The question was direct, and Amara appreciated that he had not tiptoed around it the way everyone else in her family had. She thought carefully before answering, wanting to give him the truth rather than the polite response she had given at every family gathering for the last 6 months. "I felt like I didn't have much choice," she admitted. "My parents were so happy about the match and I didn't want to disappoint them, but I also didn't hate the idea. You seemed decent from what little I knew of you. I told myself that was enough to build on." "And now?" Daniel asked quietly. Amara looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the earnestness in his expression, the way he waited for her answer without any trace of impatience. "Now I think there might be more here than I expected," she said honestly. Something shifted in Daniel's face, a quiet kind of relief mixed with something warmer, something that looked almost like hope. He did not push the moment further, did not try to close the distance between them too quickly. Instead, he simply nodded, as if her words were a gift he intended to hold carefully. "I felt the same way when I met you the first time," he said. "At your cousin's engagement party, do you remember that?" Amara tried to recall the evening, Vaguely, there were so many people there. You were arguing with your cousin about which building in the city had the best rooftop view. You were very passionate about it. Amara laughed again, surprised that he remembered such a small detail. I still think I was right. I thought so too, actually. I just didn't want to interrupt the argument. They spent the next while trading small memories, small observations, pieces of themselves that felt insignificant on their own, but together began to form something larger, something like the beginning of understanding. Amara found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn into the conversation in a way she had not expected to be drawn into anything tonight. At some point, Daniel rose from the chair and walked toward the small table near the window, where a tray had been left earlier by one of the household staff. There was tea on it, still warm beneath a cloth cover, and a plate of small pastries that neither of them had touched during the reception because they had both been too nervous to eat. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "I don't think either of us ate much today." Amara realized, with some surprise, that she was hungry. The nervous knot in her stomach had loosened enough to make room for actual hunger, something she had not expected to feel on this particular night. "A little," she said. Daniel poured 2 cups of tea and brought one over to her, along with a small plate of pastries, setting them carefully on the nightstand beside her rather than handing them directly, as if giving her space even in something as small as this. Amara appreciated the gesture more than she could easily explain. "Thank you," she said. "Of course." They sat together for a while longer, eating in a silence that no longer felt uncertain, but comfortable, the kind of silence that exists between two people who are beginning, slowly, to feel safe with each other. Amara found herself watching the candlelight flicker across Daniel's face, noticing details she had not noticed before, the small scar near his eyebrow, the way his expression softened when he was genuinely listening rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. She thought of Naomi again, briefly, and the cold, businesslike husband she had described. She thought of the fear she had carried into this room, the bracing she had done for weeks leading up to this night. None of it matched what was actually happening. None of it matched the man sitting a few feet away from her, sharing tea and pastries and quiet stories, careful with every word and every movement, as though her comfort mattered more to him than anything else in the world. For the first time since the wedding had been arranged, Amara allowed herself to feel something she had been too afraid to feel before: hope. The night stretched on, gentle and unhurried, and neither of them seemed in any rush to end the conversation. Outside, the house had gone fully silent, the last of the household staff long since retired for the evening. Inside the room, something quiet and new was beginning to take shape, something neither of them had words for yet, but something real all the same. Daniel set his empty cup down and looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Can I tell you what I hope for us?" he asked. Amara nodded, curious. "I hope we become friends first," he said. "Real friends, the kind who can talk about anything. I think everything else will follow naturally from that, when we're both ready. There's no rush, not tonight, not ever, unless it's something we both want." Amara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, unexpected and warm, and she blinked them back quickly, though Daniel noticed anyway. "Did I say something wrong?" he asked, concern flashing across his face. "No," Amara said, her voice thick. "You said something right, I just wasn't expecting it." Daniel smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Good. I'd like to keep saying the right things if you'll let me practice on you for the next 50 years or so." Amara laughed through the last of her tears, surprised again by how easily he could shift her mood, how naturally kindness seemed to come to him. "I think I can allow that." The candles burned lower still, and the night continued, quiet and unhurried, carrying with it the first fragile threads of something neither of them had expected to find on this particular evening. Amara had walked into this room bracing herself for coldness. What she found instead was a man willing to sit across a room and wait, patiently, for trust to grow on its own terms. It was, she thought, the beginning of something she had never let herself imagine. Morning came softly through the curtains, filling the room with a pale golden light. Amara woke slowly, aware first of the unfamiliar softness of the pillow beneath her head, then of the quiet sound of someone moving carefully across the room, trying not to wake her. She opened her eyes to find Daniel already dressed, standing near the window with a cup of coffee in his hand, looking out at the garden below. He must have sensed her waking because he turned and offered a small smile. "Good morning." "Good morning," Amara said, sitting up and pulling the blanket around her shoulders, still adjusting to the strangeness of waking up in a room that was now hers, beside a man who was now her husband, in a house that would take time to feel like home. "I let you sleep," Daniel said. "You look tired." "I was," Amara admitted. The emotional weight of the previous day, the wedding, the nerves, the long conversation that had stretched late into the night, had left her more exhausted than she realized until she finally closed her eyes. Daniel walked over and set a second cup of coffee on the nightstand beside her, along with a small plate of fruit. "I wasn't sure how you take your coffee, so I guessed." Amara picked up the cup and took a small sip. It was almost right, a little too sweet, but the gesture meant more to her than the taste. "Close enough. I'll remember for next time." They ate breakfast together in a comfortable quiet, the kind that had begun to feel less foreign with each passing hour. Amara found herself glancing at Daniel more than she meant to, trying to understand this new version of her life that had begun so unexpectedly gently. She had prepared herself for so many outcomes, none of which resembled the reality unfolding in front of her. After breakfast, there was a knock at the door, and Daniel's mother, Margaret, stepped inside with a warm smile, carrying a small tray of pastries as though the household simply could not stop feeding people on the morning after a wedding. "I wanted to see how my new daughter is settling in," Margaret said, setting the tray down and taking Amara's hands in hers. Her grip was warm and steady, and there was genuine affection in her eyes that caught Amara off guard. "I'm settling in well," Amara said, glancing briefly at Daniel, who was watching the exchange with quiet satisfaction. "Good," Margaret said. "This house has been too quiet for too long. It needs some new energy in it. I hope you'll feel free to make it your own." "Thank you," Amara said, touched by the warmth in the older woman's voice. Margaret stayed only a short while longer, chatting easily about small things, the garden, the weather, plans for the coming week, before excusing herself to attend to other guests who had stayed the night in the house. When she left, the room fell quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than the one from the night before, lighter, easier. "Your mother is lovely," Amara said. "She likes you already," Daniel said. "I could tell." "How could you tell?" "She only offers people pastries in the morning if she approves of them. If she didn't like you, she would have sent tea instead, and cold tea at that." Amara laughed, the sound coming easily now, without the hesitation that had marked her laughter the night before. "That's a very specific system. She's a very specific woman." Later that morning, Daniel offered to show her around the rest of the house, since she had only seen a small portion of it during the wedding preparations. They walked together through wide hallways lined with old paintings, past a library filled with books that seemed to stretch endlessly along the walls, and out into a garden that opened up behind the house, full of flowering trees and a small stone path that wound its way toward a quiet pond. "This is my favorite part of the house," Daniel said, gesturing toward a bench near the water. "I used to come out here as a boy whenever I needed to think." "It's peaceful," Amara said, taking a seat on the bench. Daniel sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, though he was still careful to leave a comfortable distance between them. "I used to imagine, when I was young, what kind of life I wanted to build," Daniel said, looking out over the water. "I never imagined it quite like this, but I think I like this version better than anything I could have planned." Amara turned to look at him. "Better how?" "Better because it's real," Daniel said. "Because you're real, and you're sitting here with me, and I get to learn something new about you every day instead of imagining a life with someone who exists only in my head." Amara felt her heart tighten with something warm and unfamiliar, something she was only beginning to recognize as the early shape of affection. She had walked into this marriage believing that hope was a dangerous thing to carry, that expecting warmth only led to disappointment. But sitting here, in a quiet garden beside a man who spoke so openly about wanting to know her, she found it harder and harder to hold onto her old fears. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "Of course." "Why were you so nervous last night? You could have simply expected things to go a certain way." "Most people would have." Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering the question carefully before answering. "Because I watched my father make my mother unhappy for years," he said finally. "Not through anything violent, nothing like that, just through carelessness. He never asked what she wanted. He assumed marriage meant she belonged to him, rather than understanding that marriage meant they belonged to each other. I watched her grow quieter every year until there was almost nothing left of the woman she used to be." Amara listened, her chest tightening with sympathy for a mother-in-law she had only just met but already admired. "She's different now," Daniel continued. "My father passed away several years ago, and slowly she found her voice again. But I promised myself I would never make my wife feel the way my mother felt for all those years. I promised myself I would ask and listen and never assume." "That's a beautiful promise," Amara said softly. "It's not always easy to keep," Daniel admitted, "but I intend to keep trying every single day." They sat together in silence for a while, watching the light shift across the surface of the pond, listening to the birds moving through the trees above them. Amara felt something settle inside her, a kind of peace she had not expected to feel this soon, this easily. "I want to tell you something too," she said finally. Daniel turned to look at her, giving her his full attention. "My friend Naomi married someone 2 years ago, in an arrangement much like ours. She warned me, before the wedding, about what to expect. She told me her husband treated their marriage like an obligation rather than a partnership. She cried when she told me, and I promised myself I would protect myself from feeling that kind of disappointment. I built walls before I even met you, because I was so afraid of becoming her." "I'm sorry you carried that fear," Daniel said gently. "I'm not sorry anymore," Amara said, surprising herself with the honesty of the statement. "Because you didn't confirm what I was afraid of, you did the opposite." Daniel reached over slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wanted to, and took her hand in his. It was a small gesture, simple and unhurried, but it felt significant in a way that words alone could not have captured. Amara let her fingers curl around his, feeling the warmth of his hand, steady and certain. "I want to keep doing the opposite," Daniel said quietly, "for as long as you'll let me." They stayed by the pond for a long while after that, talking about smaller things now, easier things, the kind of conversation that flows naturally between two people who have stopped guarding themselves quite so carefully. Amara told him more about her drawings, about the notebooks full of old windows and doorways, and Daniel promised to take her to visit an old courthouse in the city that he thought she would love to sketch. "Would you want to go this week?" he asked. "I would love that," Amara said, and she meant it completely. As the afternoon sun climbed higher over the garden, casting warm light across the water, Amara found herself thinking back to the fear she had carried into the wedding room the night before. She had braced herself for coldness, for indifference, for the kind of disappointment Naomi had warned her about. Instead, she had found a man who listened, who waited, who asked instead of assumed, and who seemed determined to build something real between them rather than something merely expected. It was, she realized, the beginning of a story she had never let herself imagine, one built not on obligation, but on patience, honesty, and the quiet, steady warmth of a man who had chosen kindness above everything else. And as she sat there, hand in hand with Daniel beside the quiet pond, she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that the future ahead of her might actually be something worth looking forward to. Later that afternoon, as the household settled into the slow rhythm of the day after a wedding, Amara found herself unpacking a small box of her belongings that had been brought over from her parents' house. Among the folded clothes and small keepsakes, she found one of her old sketchbooks, the pages filled with careful drawings of buildings she had visited over the years. She had almost left it behind, unsure if it belonged in this new chapter of her life, but something had made her pack it at the last moment. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened it slowly, flipping through pages of old churches, courthouses, and quiet stone bridges, each one a small piece of a life she had lived before this marriage began. Daniel knocked softly on the open door, having noticed her sitting there. "Is that one of the notebooks you mentioned?" he asked. Amara nodded, and to her own surprise, she felt no hesitation in inviting him to sit beside her and look through the pages together. He examined each drawing carefully, asking questions about the buildings, the details she had chosen to include, the reasons certain places had caught her attention in the first place. "You have real talent," he said, studying a detailed sketch of an old cathedral window. "This isn't just a hobby. This is something you could take seriously, if you wanted to." "I used to think about that," Amara admitted. "Studying architecture properly, maybe even working with old buildings professionally, but it never felt like a realistic path." "Why not?" "I don't know, it felt like something other people did. Something that required a kind of confidence I wasn't sure I had." Daniel closed the notebook gently and looked at her with an expression of quiet sincerity. "I think you have more confidence than you realize, and for what it's worth, I would support you fully if you ever wanted to pursue it. This house has more than enough room for your ambitions, too." Amara felt her throat tighten with emotion, unexpected and overwhelming in the best possible way. No one had ever spoken to her about her own dreams with such seriousness before, as though they mattered just as much as anyone else's. "Thank you," she said softly. "You don't have to thank me for believing in you," Daniel said. "I plan on doing it often." The afternoon light shifted slowly across the room as they continued talking, moving from old sketchbooks to future plans, from small memories to quiet hopes, each conversation drawing them closer together in ways neither of them had expected on the morning after their wedding. Amara found herself laughing more freely, speaking more openly, letting go, piece by piece, of the guarded fear she had carried into this marriage. By the time evening arrived again, painting the sky outside in soft shades of orange and pink, Amara understood something she had not understood the night before, that the coldness she had braced herself for had never truly existed in this house at all. What existed instead was patience, warmth, and a man determined to build something honest, one quiet conversation at a time. And for the first time in a long while, Amara allowed herself to look forward to whatever came next. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither Amara nor Daniel had expected but both welcomed. Every morning began with coffee shared in comfortable quiet, and every evening ended with long conversations that stretched later than either of them intended. Amara found herself waking each day with something she had not felt in months, anticipation rather than dread. True to his word, Daniel took her to the old courthouse in the city that week, a tall stone building with high arched windows and intricate carvings along its entrance. Amara spent nearly 2 hours sketching while Daniel sat nearby, sometimes reading, sometimes simply watching her work with quiet fascination. "You get a certain look on your face when you draw," he told her as they walked back toward the car afterward. "Like the rest of the world disappears." "It feels that way sometimes," Amara admitted. "It's the only time my mind goes completely quiet." "I like watching it happen," Daniel said. "I hope you'll let me come with you often." "I'd like that." Their friendship, if it could still be called only friendship, deepened with each outing, each shared meal, each late-night conversation about family, dreams, and the small details of their pasts that made them who they were. Amara learned that Daniel had a habit of humming quietly when he was concentrating, that he preferred his tea slightly too strong, that he had a scar on his hand from an accident in the family workshop as a teenager. Daniel learned that Amara disliked loud parties but loved quiet gatherings with close friends, that she had a habit of tapping her pencil against her notebook when she was thinking through a difficult sketch, that she had once wanted to travel to see the great cathedrals of Europe, but had never found the courage to go alone. "We could go together," Daniel said one evening as they sat in the garden after dinner, the sky above them scattered with early stars. Once things settle down here, once the business allows me some time away, we could visit every cathedral you've ever wanted to see." Amara looked at him, surprised by how easily he offered his time, his plans, his future, as though weaving her dreams into his own was simply the natural next step. "You would really do that?" she asked. "I would do almost anything to see that look on your face when you're sketching something you love," Daniel said. "Watching you happy has become one of my favorite things." Amara felt her cheeks warm, and she looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond to such open affection. It still surprised her, even after days of gentle kindness, how easily Daniel expressed what he felt. She had grown up in a family where affection was often implied rather than spoken, and Daniel's directness, though it caught her off guard, was slowly teaching her that honesty did not have to be frightening. "I'm not used to this," she admitted quietly. "People being so open about their feelings." "Would you prefer I hold back?" Daniel asked, his voice gentle, careful not to make her feel pressured either way. "No," Amara said quickly. "I think I just need time to get used to it, in a good way." Daniel nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. "Take all the time you need, I'm not going anywhere." That simple reassurance settled something in Amara's chest, a quiet confirmation that this marriage, unlike the one she had feared, was not going to demand more from her than she was ready to give. Daniel seemed content to let trust build slowly, brick by brick, rather than expecting it to appear fully formed overnight. Later that week, Amara's mother, Grace, came to visit, eager to see how her daughter was settling into her new life. Amara welcomed her warmly, showing her through the house, the garden, the library that had quickly become one of her favorite rooms. Over tea in the sitting room, Grace studied her daughter carefully, searching for any sign of unhappiness she might need to address. "You look well," Grace said finally, relief evident in her voice. "Happier than I expected, honestly." "I am happy," Amara said, and she realized, saying the words aloud, how true they had become. "Daniel has been wonderful." Grace reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. "I worried, you know, about sending you into a marriage you didn't choose entirely for yourself. I worried you would carry resentment, the way some women do." "I did carry fear," Amara admitted honestly. "I expected the worst, based on stories I had heard from other brides, but Daniel has been patient with me from the very first night. He never once made me feel pressured into anything." Grace's eyes filled with quiet tears. "I'm so relieved to hear that. I prayed you would find kindness, even if love took time to grow." "I think it's growing faster than I expected," Amara said softly, surprising herself with the admission. Grace smiled, squeezing her daughter's hand once more before shifting the conversation to lighter topics. The garden, the wedding photographs that had just arrived, plans for a family dinner in the coming weeks. But the quiet exchange between mother and daughter had settled something important in Amara's heart. She was no longer merely enduring her marriage. She was beginning, genuinely, to embrace it. That evening, after Grace had returned home, Amara found Daniel in the library, a book open on his lap though his attention seemed elsewhere, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. She sat down beside him, close enough now that the distance between them had become far smaller than it had been on their first night together. "Everything all right?" she asked, noticing the thoughtful furrow in his brow. "I was thinking about something my father used to say," Daniel said quietly. "He used to say that people show you who they really are in small moments, not big ones. The way someone treats a stranger, the way someone reacts when things don't go as planned. He said if you pay attention to the small moments, you never have to guess about someone's character." "Do you think you've learned who I really am then?" Amara asked, half teasing, half genuinely curious. Daniel turned to look at her, his expression softening. "I think I've learned that you're braver than you give yourself credit for. You walked into a marriage you didn't choose, carrying fears most people would never admit to carrying, and you chose to be honest with me anyway, night after night, even when honesty was difficult. That takes more courage than most people realize." Amara felt her eyes sting with unexpected emotion, touched by how clearly he saw her, how carefully he had been paying attention all along. "I think I've learned the same thing about you," she said. "That you're patient in a way most people aren't, that you listen before you speak, that you would rather wait for something real than rush toward something empty." Daniel reached over and gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face, his touch light and careful, asking permission in the smallest of gestures. Amara did not pull away. Instead, she leaned slightly into the warmth of his hand, surprising them both with how natural the movement felt. "I'm grateful for you," Daniel said quietly. "More than I know how to say." "I'm grateful for you too," Amara whispered. They sat together in the quiet library for a long while after that, the book forgotten on Daniel's lap, the evening settling around them with a softness that felt entirely different from the anxious silence of their wedding night. Amara thought back to the fear she had carried into this marriage, the walls she had built in anticipation of coldness and disappointment. Piece by piece, those walls had come down, not through pressure or force, but through patience, honesty, and the quiet, steady kindness of a man who had never once asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was. And as she sat there, safe and warm beside him, Amara understood that whatever fears had once defined her expectations of this marriage no longer had any power over her. What she felt now, sitting in the quiet glow of the library lamps, was something far stronger than fear. It was trust, and it was growing day by day into something that felt very much like love. A week later, while looking for a spare pen in Daniel's study, Amara came across an old letter tucked between the pages of a ledger left open on the desk. She had not meant to read it. She had only been searching for something to write with, but her eyes caught on her own name near the top of the page, and curiosity got the better of her before she could stop herself. The letter was from Daniel's uncle, written several months before the wedding, and it spoke plainly about the family business, about debts that had accumulated over the past 2 years, about how a marriage between the two families would help stabilize things financially for both sides. It spoke of Amara's family's resources, of timing, of practical benefits that had nothing to do with affection or choice. Amara set the letter down slowly, her hands trembling slightly. She had known, of course, that the marriage had been arranged with practical considerations in mind. Every marriage in her family's circle carried some element of that, but seeing it written so plainly, so coldly, stirred something uncomfortable in her chest, a doubt she thought she had already set aside. Had Daniel's kindness these past 2 weeks been genuine? Or had it simply been part of an arrangement designed to keep both families satisfied, a performance meant to secure something valuable for his side of the family? She sat with the letter for a long while, her earlier piece unraveling thread by thread as old fears crept back in. By the time Daniel found her that evening, quieter than usual, something in her expression must have told him immediately that something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked, sitting down across from her, careful as always to give her space rather than crowd her. Amara hesitated, unsure how to voice what she had found without sounding accusatory, without unraveling the fragile trust they had built together over the past 2 weeks. But she had promised herself honesty, and she owed him the same courtesy she had asked of him. "I found a letter," she said quietly, "from your uncle, about the business and the debts and how our marriage helped both families financially." Daniel's expression shifted, understanding dawning slowly, followed by something that looked like quiet regret. "I should have told you about that myself," he said. "I'm sorry you found it this way." "So it's true," Amara said, her voice smaller than she intended. "Parts of it are true," Daniel admitted. "My family's business did face financial difficulty 2 years ago. My uncle did suggest the marriage as one way to help stabilize things." "But Amara, that letter only tells part of the story." "What's the rest of it?" she asked, her voice tight with the effort of holding back tears she did not fully understand. Daniel took a slow breath before continuing. "The financial benefit was real, yes, but I want you to understand something important. I could have said no. My family would have found another way to manage the debt eventually, even if it took longer, even if it meant selling part of the business. I agreed to the marriage because when I met you at your cousin's engagement party, I found myself thinking about you long after that evening ended. When my parents suggested the arrangement months later, I didn't agree because of the financial benefit. I agreed because I wanted the chance to know you better." Amara searched his face, looking for any sign of dishonesty, any hint that he was simply telling her what she wanted to hear. But all she found was the same quiet sincerity that had characterized every conversation they had shared since their wedding night. "How can I be sure that's true?" she asked softly, hating how vulnerable the question made her feel. "You can't be sure, not completely, not yet," Daniel said honestly. "Trust takes time to build, and I understand if this letter has shaken some of what we've built so far. All I can offer you is my word and my actions going forward. I know that might not feel like enough right now." Amara looked down at her hands, turning the letter over slowly, rereading the practical, businesslike language that had unsettled her so deeply. She thought about the past 2 weeks, the quiet mornings, the shared sketchbooks, the conversation in the garden, the tenderness in the library. None of those moments had felt calculated or performed. They had felt real, unguarded, genuine. But doubt, once planted, was not so easily uprooted. "I need some time to think," she said quietly. "Take all the time you need," Daniel said, though she could see the worry in his eyes, the fear that he might have lost something important before it had fully had the chance to grow. "I won't push you. I just hope you'll let me prove myself to you, in whatever way you need." Amara nodded, though she did not trust herself to say anything further without her voice breaking. She excused herself and walked out into the garden, seeking the same quiet space that had brought her comfort before, hoping it might offer some clarity now. She sat by the pond for a long while, watching the water ripple gently in the evening breeze, turning the events of the past 2 weeks over in her mind. She thought about Naomi again, about the fear she had carried into this marriage, about how easily that fear had begun to dissolve under Daniel's patient kindness. Had she been foolish to let her guard down so quickly? Had she mistaken performance for genuine affection? But even as the doubt circled through her mind, she found herself remembering small details that a performance could not easily explain. The way Daniel had guessed her coffee order and remembered to adjust it the next morning. The way he had listened, truly listened, to her stories about her sketchbooks, asking thoughtful questions rather than simply nodding along politely. The quiet vulnerability in his voice when he had spoken about his father's mistakes, about his promise never to repeat them. None of those moments had felt rehearsed. They had felt like a man slowly, carefully, opening himself up to someone he genuinely wanted to know. Still, she could not shake the unsettled feeling entirely, and she remained by the pond long after the sun had set, wrapped in her own uncertainty, unsure how to move forward. It was Priya who found her there an hour later, having come to visit and been told by one of the household staff where Amara had gone. Her sister sat down beside her without a word at first, simply offering quiet company the way sisters often do when words feel insufficient. "What's wrong?" Priya finally asked. Amara explained everything, the letter, the financial arrangement, the doubt now creeping into what had felt, until today, like the beginning of something genuinely good. Priya listened carefully, without interrupting, until Amara finished. "Can I tell you something?" Priya said gently, once Amara had finished speaking. "Please." Every marriage in our family, including mine, began with some practical consideration attached to it. That's simply how things work in families like ours. But practical beginnings don't have to define what a marriage becomes. What matters isn't why the arrangement was first suggested. What matters is what the two people build together afterward, whether they choose to make it real. Amara considered her sister's words carefully. How do I know if Daniel is choosing to make it real, or simply going through the motions because it benefits his family? You told me yourself just now about the coffee, about the sketchbooks, about the conversation in the library, Priya said. Does any of that sound like a man simply going through the motions? Amara thought about it honestly, setting aside her fear long enough to examine the evidence clearly. No, she admitted finally. It doesn't. Then maybe the letter revealed something you already knew, in a way that simply felt more uncomfortable than expected, Priya said gently. The financial arrangement was real, yes, but so is everything you've described happening between you these past 2 weeks. Both things can be true at once. Amara sat with her sister's words for a long while, feeling something in her chest begin to settle, the sharp edges of her doubt softening into something more manageable. She thought about Daniel's face when he had explained the letter to her, the honesty in his voice, the worry in his eyes at the possibility that he might have lost her trust before it had fully taken root. "I think I need to talk to him again," Amara said finally. Priya squeezed her hand and smiled. "I think that's a good idea." Amara thanked her sister and walked back toward the house slowly, gathering her thoughts as she went, preparing herself for a conversation she knew would require both honesty and courage from both of them. She found Daniel exactly where she expected him to be, in the library, sitting near the window with a book he clearly was not reading, his attention fixed instead on the darkened garden outside. He looked up when she entered, and she saw immediately the tension in his shoulders, the quiet worry he had been carrying since their earlier conversation. "Can we talk?" Amara asked softly. "Of course," Daniel said, setting the book aside and giving her his full attention. Amara sat down across from him, close enough now that the distance between them had become almost meaningless, though the emotional distance created by the afternoon's revelation still lingered in the air. "I talked to Priya," she said. "She helped me understand something I already knew but hadn't fully let myself accept." "What's that?" Daniel asked carefully. "That the reasons a marriage begins don't have to be the reasons it continues," Amara said. "I know the financial arrangement was real. I understand why that letter existed, why your family suggested this marriage in the first place. But I also know what I've experienced these past 2 weeks, and none of it felt like performance." Daniel's expression softened with relief, though he remained quiet, letting her continue. "I think what scared me most wasn't the money," Amara continued. "It was the fear that I had been foolish to trust so quickly, that I had let my guard down for something that wasn't real. I built those walls for a reason, Daniel. I built them because I was afraid of being disappointed the way Naomi was disappointed." "I understand that fear," Daniel said gently. "And I meant what I said earlier. I can't prove with words alone that what's growing between us is real. I can only keep showing you, every day, for as long as it takes." Amara looked at him for a long moment, searching his face one final time, and found nothing but sincerity looking back at her. "I believe you," she said finally, and she felt the truth of the words settle deep in her chest as she spoke them. "I think I was looking for a reason to be afraid because fear felt safer than hope, but I don't want to live that way anymore." Daniel reached across the small distance between them and took her hand, his grip warm and steady, grounding her in the moment the way it had on the bench by the pond weeks earlier. "I don't want you to live that way either," he said. "I want you to feel safe enough to hope, every single day, for as long as we're together." Amara felt tears gather in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of fear or doubt. They were tears of relief, of release, of something in her chest finally letting go of a burden she had carried for far too long. "Can I tell you something I haven't told you yet?" she said quietly. "Anything." "I think I'm falling in love with you," Amara said, the words trembling slightly as she spoke them, unfamiliar and terrifying and wonderful all at once. "I didn't expect it to happen this quickly. I didn't think I would allow myself to feel this way at all, not after everything I braced myself for before our wedding night. But it's true, and I didn't want to keep it from you any longer." Daniel's breath caught, and for a moment he simply looked at her, his eyes bright with an emotion Amara recognized because she felt the same thing mirrored in her own chest. "I fell in love with you before I even walked into that room on our wedding night," Daniel admitted softly. "I was terrified, that first evening, not because of what was expected of me, but because I already knew how much I wanted this to be real, and I was afraid of doing something to ruin it before it had the chance to become what I hoped it could be." Amara felt a warmth spread through her chest, unlike anything she had felt before, gentle and overwhelming all at once. She reached out, closing the last of the distance between them, and Daniel met her halfway, his hand coming up to rest gently against her cheek, his thumb brushing softly along her skin. "I'm not afraid anymore," Amara whispered. "Neither am I," Daniel said. The moment that followed was quiet and unhurried, built on weeks of patience and honesty rather than expectation. Daniel leaned forward slowly, giving her every chance to close the distance herself if she wanted to, and when their lips finally met, it was gentle, careful, full of the same tenderness that had defined every interaction between them since that very first night. There was nothing rushed about it, nothing demanded. It was simply two people who had chosen, patiently and honestly, to trust each other completely. When they finally parted, Amara rested her forehead against his, both of them breathing slowly, savoring the quiet warmth of the moment. "I braced myself for coldness," Amara whispered. "I never imagined I would find this instead." "I'm glad I could be wrong about everything you expected," Daniel said softly, a smile touching his lips. They stayed together in the quiet library for a long while after that, no longer separated by distance or doubt, simply present with each other in a way that felt entirely new and entirely right. Amara thought about the letter that had frightened her so deeply only hours earlier, and she realized that instead of breaking what they had built together, it had strengthened it, forcing both of them to speak honestly about fears and doubts that might otherwise have festered quietly beneath the surface for months or years. Trust, she realized, was not built in a single moment. It was built through exactly this kind of testing, this kind of honesty, this willingness to sit with discomfort long enough to work through it together rather than letting it drive them apart. As the evening deepened around them, and the candles in the library burned low, Amara felt something settle permanently into place within her, a quiet certainty that whatever fears she had once carried into this marriage no longer had any real power over her future. What she had found instead, in the space where fear once lived, was something steady, something real, something worth every moment of vulnerability it had taken to reach it. It was love, patient and true, exactly the kind she had once believed impossible to find in a marriage built on arrangement rather than choice. And as she sat there in the quiet glow of the library, held gently in Daniel's arms, Amara understood that she had been wrong to ever doubt that something so genuine could grow from such uncertain beginnings. Some of the deepest kinds of love, she was learning, did not announce themselves loudly on the first night. They grew slowly, quietly, built one honest conversation at a time, until one day, without warning, they simply became impossible to deny. The morning after their conversation in the library, the entire household seemed to notice a change, though no one spoke of it directly. Margaret smiled a little wider over breakfast, watching her son and new daughter-in-law share quiet glances across the table. The household staff moved with a lighter energy, sensing, as staff often do, that whatever tension had lingered in the house over the past weeks had finally eased into something calmer and more settled. Amara felt different too, lighter somehow, as though a weight she had carried for months, perhaps years, had finally been set down. She caught herself smiling for no particular reason throughout the day, humming quietly while she worked on a new sketch in the garden, laughing more freely during conversations that would have felt guarded only a week earlier. Daniel noticed the change as well, and he seemed determined to nurture it carefully, continuing the same patient attentiveness that had first begun to dissolve her fears on their wedding night. He brought her coffee each morning, closer to the way she actually liked it now, having learned from careful observation rather than guesswork. He asked about her sketches with genuine curiosity, sat with her during long afternoons in the garden, and continued sharing small pieces of himself, his memories, his hopes, his quiet insecurities, building trust brick by brick, the way he had promised from the very beginning. One afternoon, as they walked together through the city near the old courthouse, Amara found herself telling him about a specific fear she had never voiced to anyone before, not even Priya. "I used to think love was something that happened to other people," she admitted, as they walked slowly along a quiet street lined with old stone buildings. "My parents' marriage was practical, respectful, but never particularly warm. I grew up believing that was simply what marriage was supposed to look like. Comfortable but not passionate, safe but not deeply connected. And now, Daniel asked, glancing over at her with quiet interest. Now I understand that I was only seeing one version of what marriage could be, Amara said. I didn't know it could also look like this, like two people choosing each other honestly, again and again, every single day. Daniel reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers as they continued walking. I want to keep choosing you every day for as long as you'll let me. Amara squeezed his hand gently. I plan on letting you for a very long time. Their relationship continued to deepen over the following weeks, built not on singular dramatic moments, but on the steady accumulation of small, honest choices. They visited old buildings together so Amara could sketch, hosted quiet dinners with both of their families, and slowly began transforming the house into something that felt genuinely shared between them, rather than simply inherited from Daniel's family history. Amara began sketching more seriously, encouraged constantly by Daniel's genuine enthusiasm for her talent. She started taking on small architectural drawing projects for family friends, slowly building a modest portfolio that reflected both her skill and her growing confidence. Daniel, in turn, began setting aside more time from the family business to pursue his own long-abandoned interest in architecture, taking evening courses at a local university, something he had never felt free to consider before their marriage began. You inspired this, you know, he told her one evening, showing her a set of preliminary drawings he had completed for his course. Watching you pursue your sketches again made me realize I didn't have to let go of my own dreams just because life had taken a different direction. I'm proud of you, Amara said, studying his careful drawings with genuine admiration. These are wonderful. Not as wonderful as yours, Daniel said, smiling. We'll have to agree to disagree. Their families noticed the change in both of them as the months passed, the quiet confidence that had grown in place of the nervous uncertainty that had marked the earliest days of their marriage. Grace visited often, always leaving with tears of happiness in her eyes at how settled and joyful her daughter had become. Margaret, too, seemed to soften further with each visit, delighted at the life blossoming within the walls of a house that had felt too quiet for too long. One evening, several months into their marriage, Amara found herself back in the garden by the pond, sketchbook open on her lap, working on a new drawing while Daniel sat beside her reading. The scene felt achingly familiar, echoing the quiet afternoon when they had first begun to open up to each other so many months earlier, though everything about it now felt different, deeper, more settled. Do you remember our wedding night? Amara asked suddenly, looking up from her sketch. Daniel looked over at her, his expression softening with memory. I remember every detail. I was so afraid, Amara said. I had convinced myself the night would be cold, that you would be distant, that our marriage would settle into something purely practical, the way I had been warned to expect. And instead, Daniel asked gently, though he already knew the answer, having lived the same journey alongside her. Instead, you sat across the room and asked if I was scared, Amara said, smiling at the memory now instead of flinching from it. You gave me tea and pastries and told me stories about your mother's advice. You waited patiently for trust to grow on its own terms, instead of demanding anything from me at all. I'm glad I did, Daniel said quietly. I think that patience is what allowed us to build something real, instead of something rushed and empty. Amara closed her sketchbook and moved closer to him on the bench, resting her head against his shoulder as the evening light softened around them. I braced myself for a cold wedding night, she said softly. I never imagined it would become the beginning of the best thing that's ever happened to me. Daniel wrapped his arm around her gently, pulling her closer. I feel exactly the same way. They sat together by the quiet pond as the sky deepened into evening, surrounded by the same garden that had witnessed the earliest, most fragile beginnings of their relationship. What had started as an arrangement built on practicality and family expectation had grown, slowly and honestly, into something neither of them had dared to hope for at the very beginning, A genuine partnership, rooted in patience, trust, and quiet, steady love. And as the stars began to appear above them, Amara understood with complete certainty that whatever fears had once defined her expectations of marriage no longer held any power over her life. What she had found instead, through patience and honesty, and the courage to remain open despite her fears, was a love more genuine and more lasting than anything she had ever imagined possible. A year passed, and the house that had once felt too quiet for Margaret's liking now echoed regularly with laughter, conversation, and the steady rhythm of two lives fully intertwined. Amara's small architectural drawing business had grown beyond what she ever expected, with several local firms now requesting her detailed sketches for restoration projects across the city. Daniel had completed his evening courses and begun quietly consulting on small architectural projects alongside the family business, slowly reshaping his career into something that reflected both his responsibilities and his passions. On the morning of their first wedding anniversary, Amara woke to find Daniel already awake beside her, watching her with the same quiet warmth that had first begun to melt her fears so many months earlier. "Good morning," he said softly. "Good morning," Amara replied, smiling as she stretched and settled comfortably against him. "Happy anniversary." "Happy anniversary," Daniel said, leaning down to press a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Do you remember what you told me on our wedding night about what you expected from this marriage?" Amara laughed softly at the memory. "I expected coldness. I braced myself for a husband who would see our marriage as nothing more than an obligation." "And what do you feel now, a year later?" Daniel asked, though the warmth in his eyes told her he already knew the answer. "I feel like the luckiest woman in the world," Amara said honestly. "I feel like I married someone who chose patience over expectation, kindness over assumption, and honesty over convenience. I feel like every fear I carried into that room was answered, gently and completely, by exactly the opposite of what I expected." Daniel pulled her closer, resting his chin gently against the top of her head. "I promised myself, that first night, that I would never let you feel like anything was owed to you. I think that promise became the foundation for everything we've built since." "It did," Amara agreed, "and I'm grateful for it every single day." They spent their anniversary quietly, visiting the old courthouse where Amara had completed her very first sketch as a married woman, walking together through the garden by the pond where so many of their earliest, most important conversations had taken place, and sharing a quiet dinner surrounded by both of their families, who had grown closer over the past year in ways none of them had anticipated when the marriage was first arranged. Later that evening, as they sat together on the same garden bench where they had shared so many important moments, Daniel turned to Amara with a quiet, thoughtful expression. "I have something I want to tell you," he said. "What is it?" "I've been offered a position with a small architectural firm downtown," Daniel said. "Nothing permanent yet, just consulting work, but it's the kind of opportunity I gave up on years ago, before I even knew I would ever have the chance to pursue it again." "Daniel, that's wonderful," Amara said, genuine excitement filling her voice. "You should absolutely take it." "I wanted your thoughts first," Daniel said. "Whatever decision I make affects both of us now, not just me." Amara felt a warmth spread through her chest at the simple, natural way he included her in decisions that shaped his future, exactly the way she had learned to include him in decisions that shaped hers. It was such a small thing, and yet it represented everything their marriage had grown to become. A genuine partnership, built on mutual respect and shared consideration, rather than the practical arrangement it had once been. "Take it," Amara said firmly. "You gave up your dream once for family responsibility. You don't have to give it up again." Daniel smiled, relief and excitement mixing together in his expression. "Thank you for believing in me." "Always," Amara said simply. As the evening deepened around them, the same quiet peace settling over the garden that had witnessed so much of their journey together, Amara found herself reflecting on how far they had come since that first anxious night, when she had sat alone in a candle-lit room, bracing herself for coldness and disappointment. She thought about the fear she had carried, built from stories of other women's disappointments, from a lifetime of watching marriages built on obligation rather than genuine connection. She thought about how close she had come to letting that fear define her entire experience of marriage, building walls so high that even genuine kindness might have struggled to break through them. But Daniel had been patient. He had waited, asked instead of assumed, listened instead of demanded, and slowly, gently proven himself worthy of the trust she had been so afraid to offer. And in doing so, he had taught her something she carried with her still, a lesson she hoped to pass on to her own children one day, should she and Daniel be fortunate enough to have them. That love built on patience and honesty was far stronger, far more lasting, than any love built on assumption or expectation ever could be. The stars emerged slowly above the garden as the evening deepened into night, the same quiet, steady stars that had witnessed the earliest beginnings of their story so many months before. Amara leaned into Daniel's warmth, feeling completely at peace with the life they had built together, a life that had started with fear and blossomed, through patience and honesty, into something genuinely beautiful. She had braced herself for a cold wedding night. What she found instead was a tenderness that had shattered every wall she had built and replaced it with something far stronger, a love built to last, one honest moment at a time. And as she sat there in the quiet garden, surrounded by everything they had built together over the past year, Amara understood, with complete certainty, that this was only the beginning of a much longer, much richer story still waiting to unfold between them. 2 years into their marriage, Amara stood in the doorway of a small studio room that had once been an unused storage space near the library, now transformed into a proper workspace filled with drawing tables, shelves of reference books, and large windows that let in soft afternoon light. Daniel had surprised her with the renovation as a gift, insisting that her growing business deserved a dedicated space of its own rather than the corner of their bedroom she had been using for months. "I still can't believe you did this without telling me," Amara said, running her hand along the smooth surface of a new drafting table. "You would have talked me out of spending the money," Daniel said, leaning against the doorframe with a satisfied smile. "This way, you couldn't argue." "I'm not arguing," Amara said, laughing softly. "I'm just amazed." Her business had grown steadily over the past year, and she now worked regularly with a heritage preservation society, creating detailed architectural drawings of buildings scheduled for restoration across the city. It was meaningful work, connecting her lifelong love of old buildings with a genuine purpose, and she often found herself thinking back to the young woman who had once believed such ambitions were reserved for other people, not for her. Daniel's own career had continued to flourish as well. What had begun as small consulting work with the downtown architectural firm had grown into a more permanent role, one that allowed him to balance his family responsibilities with the passion he had once believed was lost to him forever. They often worked side by side in the evenings now, Amara sketching at her new drafting table, while Daniel reviewed blueprints at a nearby desk, comfortable in a shared silence that had become one of their favorite parts of the day. That evening, after finishing a particularly detailed sketch of an old library facade, Amara found Daniel waiting for her in the garden, sitting on their familiar bench by the pond, watching the last light of sunset fade slowly across the water. "I have news," he said, as she settled beside him. "Good news, I hope." "Very good news," Daniel said, taking her hand gently. "We're going to have a baby." Amara stared at him for a moment, stunned, before the words fully registered. "You already knew." "The doctor called this afternoon while you were finishing your sketch," Daniel admitted, his eyes bright with emotion. "I wanted to tell you here in the place where everything really began for us." Tears filled Amara's eyes, though these, like so many tears she had shed over the past 2 years, were tears of pure happiness. She thought back to the frightened young woman who had once sat alone in a candle-lit room, bracing herself for a marriage she believed would be built entirely on obligation and coldness. That woman could never have imagined this moment, this garden, this quiet, steady joy sitting beside her. "I love you," Amara said softly, resting her hand against his cheek. "I love you too," Daniel said, "more than I ever thought possible and more every single day." They sat together in the garden as the stars began to emerge above them, the same garden where so much of their story had unfolded, quiet conversation by quiet conversation, honest moment by honest moment. Amara thought about the child they would soon welcome into this life they had built together, and she felt a deep, settled certainty that this child would grow up surrounded by exactly the kind of patient, honest love she had once believed impossible to find in a marriage built on arrangement rather than choice. She thought, too, about Naomi, about the fear that had shaped so much of her early expectations, and she made a quiet promise to herself that evening, watching the stars gather above the garden. She would tell her own children someday that love did not always announce itself with grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Sometimes it arrived quietly, patiently, built one honest conversation at a time by two people willing to set aside fear in favor of genuine connection. Sometimes the coldest expectations gave way to the warmest realities, if only two people were brave enough to remain open long enough to discover it. As the evening deepened around them, Daniel pulled Amara closer, resting his hand gently against her shoulder, and together they watched the last light fade over the quiet pond that had witnessed the entire journey of their love, from its uncertain beginning to this moment of quiet, overwhelming joy. Amara had once braced herself for a cold wedding night. What she found instead, through patience, honesty, and the courage to remain open despite her deepest fears, was a love that had shattered every wall she built, and replaced it with a life far richer, far warmer, and far more beautiful than anything she had ever dared to imagine. And as she sat there in the quiet garden, her hand resting gently over her heart, Amara understood that this was not the end of their story at all. It was simply the beginning of its next, most beautiful chapter.